Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, a podcast for creative people that want to tell new stories in new ways and have sustainable artistic careers. I'm Jonathan Ball, and I hold a PhD in creative writing, and I'm the author of many books, including poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and comics. I also own a company called Stranger Fiction. Stranger Fiction is a new publisher of unconventional genre fiction, but we also help people learn how to be more creative and have better careers. We also work with companies that need to stand out from the crowd. And Stranger Fiction, of course, also publishes this podcast. So go to strangerfiction.ca where you can find a ton of free stuff you won't see anywhere else, including the show notes for this episode. I'm really pleased to be talking to GMB Chomichuk today, who's an artist and a writer and somebody I've done a lot of, I've known for a long time. I've done a lot of work with. We're talking about The Eye Collector, which is a comic series that we have coming out of Heavy Metal. Heavy Metal's Virus Comics imprint. And so I just want to dive right into this. You can get a sense of who Gregory is and what we're doing together. This went on quite a while. We had a lot to talk about. So there's actually going to be a second part of this episode, which is going to be available from Gregory's podcast, Super Pulp Science. So on Thursday, check out Super Pulp Science and get the second part of this interview. Guest today is GMB Chomichuk, who is my co-creator for The Eye Collector, a graphic novel and comic book miniseries coming out of Heavy Metal. Gregory, let's just dive right into it and talk a little bit about how we came to do The Eye Collector.
Yeah, how did it start?
Well, for me, it goes real far back because it's kind of started in like 2001, 2002. I remember distinctly, it was kind of in the wake of September 11th, actually. And everybody was just sort of feeling discombobulated and didn't really know what was going on. I had friends asking me, like, did they think we were going to be embroiled in a war now, or what was going on? Like, it was just kind of a very shell-shocked sort of time. And in that sort of period, the university was a very, it was a place where nobody really knew what to do next. Like they didn't know, should they be having classes? Should they not be having classes? Like it was just very, confusing. And around that same time, I had this reading list that my professor, George Tolles, had given me. Now, George Tolles is, film and literature professor at the University of Manitoba, but he's also the screenwriter for many of Guy Maddin's movies. If you don't know Guy Maddin, he's a very, well-known art filmmaker in Canada and internationally regarded. So I had kind of gravitated to George in a couple of ways. One was because he's just a great prof. Was my favorite prof. But also he was straddling this interesting line of like being a prof, but also actually, making real movies, And so I really liked him. We got along really well. We had a lot of the same interests in terms of art. And we both really, really liked, he said to me, you should really read more German romantics. You'd like the German romantics. And so he gave me a little reading list. And on that list was The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which is a fairly well-known story, but not a really often read story. E.T.A. Hoffmann's best known for writing the Nutcracker suite, like the kind of works that served as the basis for that. But his arguably most important work is this short story called The Sandman, which was the story that Sigmund Freud used to develop his idea of the uncanny in a very famous essay called On the Uncanny. So I read this short story and I was so taken with this short story. Plus I had Guy Maddin in my head because I'd, really kind of been absorbing that. And I was just so enthusiastic about George and kind of doing stuff with George. I kind of reoriented my whole life to take a master's degree where I was going to work with George, and the Eye Collector was going to be my thesis. Well, it wasn't called the Eye Collector then; it was called the Sandman. I was going to write a feature-length screenplay adaptation of this out of copyright E.J. Hoffman story, and really just sort of transform it and change it, and make it my own. So that screenplay was really the first draft of this project, and then you can kind of fast forward a little bit again, that was like a long process to put that project together. But while I was putting that project together is when I met you. So maybe you want to take over and kind of dive in to the story here.
Well, that was much more comprehensive than I expected to get as to your build up to that, I have to say. More tongue in cheek, I, through a feat of charlatanism and legerdemain, managed to get myself into an advanced creative writing program that I had no reason really or credentials to be a part of. And that's where I met you. And we kind of, one of the things that I liked about your writing the whole time was that it was unabashedly esoteric, strange, and a little bit Byzantine. And then it would usually end on a really kind of amusing punchline that took all the piss and vinegar and sort of self-importance and mixed it all together into this like little sort of strange milieu. So like all this to say, I liked the writing. I liked your attitude about how writing in a lot of ways is kind of bullshit, and that you should just make stuff and try stuff and do stuff. And sometimes people like it and sometimes they won't. And so we kind of kept in touch after that initial class. And I, of course, hosted that very interesting group of writers at my own house after that class was finished. For a couple of years, we had a writers group, and always kind of flirted with the idea that there might be a project that we could find to do. And then I guess I was working on the Imagination Manifesto. This would have been like 2004 or 5 at that time. And we got together and I was showing you some of that stuff, and you were saying, oh, I have this screenplay. Oh, maybe it could be a graphic novel. I don't know what it could be. Could you do some imagery for it? And it was actually one of the first times that my work was ever stolen and republished without my knowledge or consent by a German publication. I had posted on my blog back in those days. People blogged, and so did I. And I posted some imagery from our E.T.A. Hoffman sort of exploration of this character that we started to call the Eye Collector. And it was just this weird image of this amorphous blobbed-headed creature with all these different eyes holding a handful of eyeballs. And it was just us playing around with the horror and macabre elements. And then later I found out that that image and a number of things from the blog had been stolen and reprinted in a German magazine.
This is like in 2008 or something. So
somewhere
it's quite some time ago there, even still. So keep in mind, we're talking 2021 when the first issue of the Eye Collector has, come out. And, we were doing this 5-issue story arc, right? And, but what we're talking about, this is like when we're talking now. But what we're talking about is, back in 2005 and 2006, 2007.
Like 15 years previous, we had played around with it. We just kept saying, there's something here. There's something that it could be. What could it be?
Well, and there's a couple sort of steps in there that I think are important to just quickly note and to maybe give a few people credit for. So one thing that kind of was happening in here was I had taken, like I say, I had gotten a degree with this master's thesis, The Sandman, and then I'd started to get deeper and deeper into filmmaking and screenwriting. And at one point we were, of course, you and me had this writers group that we were a part of that was hosted at your house that you mentioned. But additionally, I started hanging out with some screenwriters, and we had a sort of different writers group going on where we just sort of show up at this one bar and we'd hang out in the corner, and we would have read each other's scripts before this and giving each other feedback on it. And one of the people in that group was a very casual group that people would kind of show up sometimes and so on. But one of the people in that group was the writer-director Danishka Esterhazy, who's done a really great film recently called Level 16 that got her a lot of acclaim. And she actually, her next film is The Slumber Party Massacre. She's remaking that. She remade it. She's putting it together now. So she's, she was reading this script and she said to me, she goes, this doesn't really work as a movie at all because it isn't like you've got this character who's a kid for the first like 30, 40 minutes. And then, you got this guy who is an adult. Like he just jumps forward into being an adult. She's like, imagine how that would play out in a movie. She's like, you're with, Haley Joel Osment for 30 minutes, then he's dead. He never comes back. And then all of a sudden Tom Cruise is, in there. And, she's like, there's just no way to make that movie. Like nobody's going to allow you to make a movie with that structure. She go and the audience will feel like it's kind of two movies. So she kind of was like, either you need to kind of normalize it by doing a bit of a cross-cutting thing. She goes, or maybe it shouldn't be a movie. And, this is really more of a novel structure. Like you might just want to kind of think about it more like a book or something. And she was really right about that. But I was like, I instantly saw that she was right. And a couple other people were kind of saying similar things. And I also, though, didn't want it to be a novel. I was like, why take a prose short story and adapt it to a prose novel? Like, it just is like, I know people have done that kind of thing, but it just seemed weird and dumb to me. So I kind of didn't know what to do.
It wasn't of interest.
Yeah. And so like, I was like, well, it's kind of lame to adapt a short story as a novel, but I was like, but then I kind of, again, kind of with talking to you and seeing some of your visual work, because when I met you, when you say you work on the Imagination Manifesto, but really you were doing a novel version of the Imagination Manifesto. And it wasn't until I got to know you a little while that I actually realized you also drew and had, some talent as an illustrator and an artist. And so as I started to see, like, as I was kind of seeing more of your actual visual work, and in reading also your prose work, I started to realize, you and I had similar interests in terms of the kinds of like themes we were interested in. Like we both are really interested in this idea of what is reality and what is somebody's perception of reality and how does it twist and distort and fall apart and things of this nature. And we were also very interested in collage.
As long as we're being academic about it, we might as well get into one of the things that I'm very fascinated with is the semiotic arrival at meaning. And so, the nerd heart in me that owned a comic store and makes comics and does all these other things was always brushing up against this other part of me that recognized that, the real is that which can be recreated, and that when you represent an image over and over, it acquires meaning. And isn't that just what comics are? And don't things acquire popularity simply because we've seen them a bunch? That their inherent value is sometimes in question, and that it's only their repetition that gives it meaning. And there's all of these things that are usually not useful in a career building exercise of trying to make comics. But these were the kinds of conversations you and I would have, and it was fun to explore.
Yeah, we were both reading Baudrillard. We were both interested in the surrealists. We both really liked collage, Like I wasn't making art, like visual art, whereas you were also writing,
Well, you were making visual art. This was right around the time you made a short film and then sold it to the Comedy Network.
I guess so. I just never think of myself, like at best I was, doing some indie photography that wasn't, but I always wanted to kind of do what you were doing. Like I always wished I had a more visual eye and visual style. And I felt that I did in words, and I just felt like very in sync with you in terms of what you were interested in. And additionally, I want to say we got along, which I think is really important, if you want to work with somebody.
Yeah, it is a big deal. There's another side of it too, and I think it's important if we're talking about, if you're talking about creative collaborations and ones that work and ones that don't work. One of the things that I find myself playing different roles in different collaborations, and I collaborate with lots of different people on lots of different kinds of projects. And sometimes my role is like an encouragement machine, where the other people's best work is brought forward when I remind them everything they're capable of. And sometimes my role is as an architect to say, like, these are the different moving parts we need to put into this project. Sometimes it's as a writer, just to provide words, and other people will have those, will have the visual inputs. And sometimes it's to take other people's words and to provide a visual input. But one of the things that I've always appreciated about our collaborations on this and on some other projects not yet announced is that I never have to take the time to tell you or encourage you or in the actual value of artistic expression that may or may not be commercially important. That I never have to convince you that we're going to make art first and then figure out how to sell it second.
Sure.
That's an argument I have a lot with people, that you have to make a thing before you can decide whether it's even worth selling. And, I think it's your poet's heart that knows that creative expression is just a valuable part of being alive. And that if you make enough of something, then you can decide what to do with it. And so the Eye Collector is one of those places where we just kind of said, okay, well, we're going to make this thing. Who knows what it's for, but let's just make it anyway.
Well, the deal I made with myself when I was very young, Gregory, I grew up in a very small town and it was isolated. It wasn't like today, right? With the internet, it was just the beginnings of the internet. The internet was like, boobs and Nirvana lyrics. Like that was the whole internet. It wasn't yet like people connecting, and it wasn't yet like a thing that would help you or hurt you in terms of that connection,
right?
Across the world. I was in a town of 100 people. It was extremely isolating. I was the only person who cared about any of the things I cared about. And when I made a vow when I was very young, like now I kind of regret this vow, but I made a vow that like I was so bored, and I just vowed that I would, when I grew up and I moved out, I would never be bored again. And so my sort of way that and I also kind of made a few promises to myself in terms of like my life and creativity. So one of them was that I was going to be a writer, and that's just what I was going to do. And whether, I succeeded or failed in it, I was going to be doing it. And so I was always just sort of working on like trying to figure out how to succeed in it, but also the more important thing for me was to do it. And so there was also this sort of thing that went along with it where I made a deal for myself. And this kind of ties in what you were talking about. Like I made a deal to myself very early on in my life and writing career that I was going to allow myself to be as weird as possible in the work and not worry about its commercial potential but then after I was, the flip side of that deal was I wouldn't worry about the commercial potential of anything I was doing as I was doing it. But when I was done doing it, I would just pretend it had commercial potential. And I would do whatever I could to, put that work out as if it was commercially viable, even if nobody said it was, and even if I knew it probably wasn't. So I just never wanted to get in that trap. I think a lot of people get into of that they try to change what they're doing to be more commercially viable, or they sort of give up their ambition because they know they're doing something weird.
I'll also mention at that time, it's 2021 now, but in 2001, trend focused writing pitches was a thing.
Yes.
Right. Write the next vampire novel, write the next, whatever that thing was. Yeah. This was like a big part of how we were. And I was so disgusted by that as a notion, that you should write on trend. Because for me, writing is always about self-archaeology, and not that, any individual person has a whole bunch to say that everyone should listen to, but simply that you should try to explore some part of yourself in the creative work, so that even if the work has no financial component, if it has no artistic merit, at least you grew a little bit as a person when you're done making it?
See, I never had that lofty ambition. I just didn't want to be bored. And I thought it was boring to do what other people did. You know what I'm saying? Like
Right,
my
sure.
ambition was just simply, I don't want to write vampires if everyone's writing vampires. It's boring to me now, you know? And so perhaps I didn't, but I never like felt like it's artistically invalid to jump on the trend. I just thought it was stupid. And why would I want to do that? Like, you know, so which is probably a bit of real, you know, kneecapping in my career, but I just, it kind of ends up in the same spot as you, right? And so I thought we were very much. I really liked how you didn't seem afraid to do weird things, and in fact, you seem to be just running like headlong at the weirdness. And
Well,
what we
and
both kind of realized at a certain point, I don't think we realized this earlier, but I think what we started to realize is that how you be successful as an artist is you just keep doing the thing that other people aren't doing.
yeah, and you just don't stop doing it. And we were both in, maybe privilege is the wrong word, but we were in privileged positions that we had life architecture in place that allowed us to make other stuff, which is a fancy way of saying that we were in a position where we had other ways to make money, and so we could make art that didn't make money.
Yeah, or at least we were tenacious enough to like just find other ways to make money, you know? So it was a bit of both things, right? But I think like if we would just want to fast forward a little bit here, even though we were kind of eyeing up this collaboration early on, you know, it never really materialized for quite some time, which, you know, is due for a lot of reasons. One is, you know, both of us were just sort of like, had various personal life reasons we couldn't just sink all our time into this thing. But the other side of it, though, is like we're both, as you mentioned, like we're both people who do a lot of different things, and we just kind of pursue a lot of different projects. And like the idea always is like, well, if you do 10 things, maybe one of them will hit, and then like I'll follow that one for a while, right? And so it just sort of was a situation where we both were doing a lot of work, but we weren't really working on this thing together, even if we kind of crossed paths and worked on something else here and there together. But finally, I kind of got to the point where I really wanted to take comics more seriously. And
I'm glad you brought up that seriousness moment, because I also had reached a place at that, you know, just in the last like couple of years where I no longer did things that were whimsical for the sake of their whimsy. I also decided that I would only work with people who were serious about their whimsy.
yeah,
Right? Like it's okay to have flights of fancy. In fact, I love that and encourage that in almost everyone I meet. I always want people to try and experiment with stuff. But if you're only experimenting and you're going to do it for a couple of weeks and then you're done, I do not want to work on a creative project with you. If you're serious about a year-long exploration of like some weird thing, man, let's sign up and really delve into it. And that's kind of, you had said, I'm going to be serious about making graphic novels. Let's do this. And I had a place in my schedule where I really wanted to just explore some different kinds of visual contexts. And then lo and behold, the world decided that we both needed a break from our regular workaday lives, and they canceled the whole world with a global pandemic, and we finally had some time to work on this one.
just so that people could do the eye collector.
Yeah, well, no, I don't want to reduce the amount of suffering that this has caused into my own.
But even without the pandemic, we had put the infrastructure in place to work on it before that. Like what we had done leading up to the pandemic hitting was, again, I decided, you know, I want to get a bit more serious about doing this. I needed a project that I felt like where I was very intimidated by writing comic. And so I was like asking, I don't know if you remember, but I was like asking you like questions, you know, incessantly about making comics, where I'd be like, how many pages should a comic be? How many, you know, what do I do about this? You know, what do I do about that? Like where should the surprises go? Like you'd give me all these like very technical answers to questions, which I had really been appreciating. And so I kind of started to get to the point where I was like, well, if I need to work on a comic and I become a real comics writer, there's a couple things that have to happen. I started like, I'm very analytical. So I started like going through the checklist. I'm like, the easiest way to do this would be to do with Gregory. Because then if I don't know what I'm doing, I can just ask him. I go, and also I know Gregory is not going to draw exactly what I tell him to draw. So if I screw up the script, he'll just fix it. Right.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things that I find interesting or hard to get across to some collaborators is that if you just need an illustrator, I'm not your guy. If you're willing to explore the illustration potential around this idea, I'm interested in that. And so, you inadvertently had created that scenario for yourself.
Yeah. And then I also did a thing that I think a lot of people don't do, but need to kind of like think about doing like at that sort of stage, is that I had then like spent some money buying pages from you, actually getting, a group of pages together. So I sunk some, personal money, like, a good little chunk of change into getting some pages together, so that I could then put together a grant proposal or some, pitches out to magazines or not magazines, but publishers and so on. And then it so happened that that investment, paid off after a few grant allocations, and we got some money to put together an issue. And then, as that issue started to come together, I got another grant to do a bit more, and we kind of started to ladder it up like that. But there was a couple of things that happened in there. So one was, I did some personal investment to kind of put me in place where I could get some actual, grant money from the Manitoba Arts Council and the Winnipeg Arts Council, who have really been generous with this particular project. But also in the spirit of collaboration that you're talking about, this is when, in this sort of mix, is when I decided that I wanted to kind of offer to bring you on as like a full co-creator who actually has a stake in the ownership of this and so on, rather than, a hired gun.
Yeah, because when we were talking originally, it was like, hey, I want to do this graphic novel. And I said, okay, well, yeah, I illustrate graphic novels professionally. Here are my rates, and here's how it would work. Here's the ways I do work. Here's the ways I don't work when I'm working in this fashion. And, you and I always had these tongue-in-cheek conversations where I would say, like, unless I own it, and then it's different,
Yeah.
or unless I have a piece of it, then it's different. Then my rate is always different if I have a piece of it after. Because I had learned the hard way that it's really important to own your own intellectual property outright if you ever want to leverage it in another way. It's really hard to make a living as an artist at the best of times, and these aren't necessarily the best of times. So it became, really, I had to be a little bit Machiavellian in my way of approaching this project, just because also, when you're working with a friend, it can be very difficult to mix business with friendship. And so I just had to have a certain number of things set up to create the temperature of that relationship. And then at a certain point, you just said, hey, how would you do this? What would you do this? If you're going to fix this or change this or do whatever, come and be a part of it. And that, that changes everything, because then the role of the work is not just an interpretation of somebody else's idea to the best of your ability to interpret their idea, but a scaffolding together of two sets of conditions that will then make work.
Another thing that kind of is in the mix here in terms of how I was thinking about it was, again, I had been, following your career, of course, because we, knew each other, and I'd seen all the stuff that you were doing, we're always kind of in each other's orbits there. And so I was seeing all the stuff you were doing and just kind of following all the things you had done. And I could see very clearly, like, where your work was going was very much into a space where I thought it would work for this project. And I also started to really clearly see what I thought you could bring to the project on top of and beyond like what I was doing or what I thought I could bring to it. And so something that kind of like, on one hand, this was a story that I had been sitting with for a long, long time and had a very personal like connection to, and didn't necessarily just want to part with. But at the same time, it was a story that I was really loosely basing on an existing property, like very loosely. By the time that where you're like, looking at the new version, like it's so far removed from even my original adaptation, which was already very far removed from the original story, that the Sandman's almost like a man in the moon at this point, more than the Sandman. But and of course, we're not calling it the Sandman, it's the Eye Collector, right? But it had just gotten so far away from the original idea. It had gotten more personal in many ways, but I just kind of been with the idea so long that it kind of felt like and I'd seen so much of your stuff that I knew that even if you changed a lot of it, we both had so many similar ways of looking at this kind of material that the core of it would stay the same. And so I felt like the best way to get the best like stuff out of you, really, like, and really, I thought you could really elevate the project in a way that like beyond just providing artwork and illustration for it. So I thought it was, really a great kind of, match made in hell in that respect.
Well, it's nice of you to say that. It's important, I think, for the listener to know that usually what would happen is Jonathan would provide me with a script page, and 70% of it I would kind of try to cling to the main beat. But then if a visual element, struck, I would go immediately very far afield of the original concept and maybe twist it or look at it from a different point of view, or include repetition of imagery instead of the called for script beats. So from a certain type of writer's point of view, it would have been a nightmare to see that kind of change arrive every time a script page was delivered. And instead it became a way of Jonathan would write this thing in the script pages that would say, this is what I think should happen unless you can draw something more interesting. And then it became a challenge for me to try and say, okay, what would be a more interesting way to represent this that is in keeping with the previous pages and in keeping with where we want the story to go, and is in keeping with this experimental language that we're trying to, develop. And none of that having anything to do with what a typical substantive editor would say, this is good for the reader, right? We didn't do that at the beginning.
Yeah, like I feel very confident in my skills as a writer, but it was a territory. Like, this is the first comic I've ever written. So I certainly didn't feel like I was like the god of comics, who needed to come in and art direct the whole thing. In fact, I kind of really felt I was going to have to lean on you. And so, it would just make sense for you to kind of be a co-creator in the whole thing. I also just felt it would give you a bit more like emotional stake in the project, and you'd kind of take it more seriously,
Well, it's always the way it works, right? If anyone wants to take a page and figure out how to apply it to their own process, if you make people part of a project rather than just complicit in it, you'll get a lot more out of them.
Yeah, and maybe we should start to kind of talk a bit at this point about like where we brought Lyndon into the project, and kind of how our process of working was. You kind of started to touch on it, but like, why don't you talk in a bit more of a precise way about how things kind of went from my script pages to the final page?
Okay, but before we do that, before we get there, let me counter offer a question to you, John.
All right.
We are pitching The Eye Collector as a horror story. Why don't you first tell me what a horror story is supposed to be, and whether you think The Eye Collector succeeds or fails in this idea of being scary?
Sure. Well, I have really specific ideas about what a horror story is or should be. So, take what I'm saying with a bit of with the grain of salt of, that this is coming from my very specific point of view on what horror is or should be. So I could talk about this forever, but just to really quickly kind of run through the concept. I think when horror is at its best, is when it is occupying kind of radical point of view. And this radical point of view gets symbolized in the monster. I think the best horror has a monster that has really particular qualities. It's a thing that should not be. It's a thing that, is doing things it should not do. It's this abnormal, transgressive thing. But I think it's also symbolic of a fate worse than death from the point of view of the protagonist, which is always at some level coming back to this shattering of reality. I think the monster represents this total antithesis of what the protagonist, the victim or potential victim thinks the world is. But also, and I think the best horror goes a step further of arguing thematically that the monster is the truth and the monster is right. And the monster is the moral center of the story in a strange way. Like on the surface, it seems like the monster is, the problem because fundamentally it's here killing everybody, destroying everything. But I think the best horror, or at least the most radical and interesting horror to me, also goes a step further and posits that this monster is correct to do the things that it is doing. It represents the true point of view. This is what reality is the horror story is so much about, it seems like this monster shouldn't exist, and yet here it is, we have to get rid of it to re-establish our sense of reality. And I think like the best horror just kind of insists that the monster can't be killed, that the monster is the truth and everything else is a lie. The monster is not part of the coming from the outside, not, this alien creature, but actually something fundamental to reality itself. And in a way, it's more real than everything else, even though it might seem like this dream-like thing. And it has a point of view that is, in a strange sort of way, correct. And the solution that very few protagonists ever succeed in, like the solution to the horror story on a certain level is to stop being horrified by the monster. But of course, almost nobody, and just accept its truth. If you can accept the truth of the monster, then you can survive. And you see that in horror. There's a trope in horror where you see that play out in a very simplistic way. That's the trope where people just ignore that the monster is real. They can't believe it, and so therefore they fall victim to it. That's where people like they find like a body drained of blood with 2 punctures in its neck, and they're like, "Oh, what could do this?" And it's, right? Like that's the trope where it's like they just can't believe monsters are real. Of course, monsters aren't real. Therefore, they fall victim and are killed by the monster. And only the people. So there's like that's the one class of victims in the horror story. There's another class of victims that accept the truth. At a certain point, they just can't deny anymore that the monster is real. They have to accept that the monster is real, but they refuse to. They're trying to get rid of the monster, and they're trying to deny its reality, shut it out of reality, destroy it, put it back into hell, whatever. Right? I think the most radical horror goes this extra step, and the protagonists have to accept and become monsters. And I'm not saying this is what happens in the Eye Collector. I would argue. There's some complicated things happening in the Eye Collector, but I think there's that level at which, as people read this story, like the Eye Collector, what I realized at a certain point in our collaboration was, as I was rewriting my old versions of things, is that I kind of moved the Eye Collector from being this, threatening, nightmarish, kind of more stock figure to being this figure who really sees himself as right. And he's just there to help from his point of view, from the Eye Collector's point of view. And the Eye Collector, of course, has all the points of view, right? From his point of view, he doesn't understand why these people are so terrified. They should just, all he's trying to do is give them what they want. And really, in a strange sort of way, the most frightening thing in this story is the revelation of what they truly want. And that's in some respects the things they start to fight against. So that doesn't get us too fully in. That's just kind of staying on the theme level without giving away too much plot.
Yeah,
but
and this is all to say that one of the reasons why when you ask how did I approach the page, I think what's important for for anyone interested in this story or the way that we work to understand is that I had this conversation, which you just summarized, many times with you in many different ways and many different iterations for years. So before I approached the page, I knew that my collaborator had a certain range of changes that would be acceptable given their point of view on what horror is. Right. So I kind of knew where I could traverse because of these definitions that, even as I asked you this question, I anticipated many of the ways you would summarize this because we've had this conversation. So I would keep those things, that list of things in mind whenever I would go through a script.
So that was me talking to Gregory Chomichuk about the Eye Collector. And remember, this is just part 1. Part 2 is coming out Thursday on Gregory's podcast, Super Pulp Science. So go subscribe to my favorite podcast, Super Pulp Science, and check out part 2 of our discussion concerning the Eye Collector.